This .NET API has a problem. And the problem is that anytime it throws an exception, it is being converted into a 500 internal server error. And because of that, it is too hard to diagnose what's going on with the API when one of those exceptions happen. So today I'm going to show you how to implement a global exception handler so we can properly map each of those exceptions into corresponding HTTP responses that have all the relevant information for us to diagnose what's going on. And so, like I said, anytime we execute one of these requests, either this first one here that retrieves all the games or the second one that retrieves a game just by ID, we're just getting this 500 internal server error. Now, one thing to notice here is that I have modified the application so that it behaves as if it was in production as opposed to my local development environment. And how did I do that? Well, what I did is, let me show you. I'm just going to stop my server briefly and close this. I went into my launch settings.json file under the properties directory right here. And I went ahead and modified this value here. Right, for my HTTP profile, I changed the ASP.NET Core environment variable from development into production, right? Because by default, what you're going to have here is just development like this, and this is going to have a different experience, right? So if I just go ahead and run this, what I'm going to see is that if we go back into hello exceptions here and just send a request, it's going to be kind of similar, but now we're going to have the entire stack trace right there in the response, right? And so this is not the experience that you're going to get in production, right? And you should not get ever this experience in production because it's just revealing too much about what's going on inside, right? What we really care about is the production experience, not the development experience. Right? So let's close this and let's stop the server and let's go ahead and just revert that back into production. So how can we improve that experience so that we have more information to diagnose the issues, right? So let's close this and let's close that and let's go into our program.cs file, right? So this is where we define our API, like I said, it has two endpoints defined right here. And the repository itself has been modified to throw some exceptions forcefully so we can start investigating what's going on, right? So it's not really important to see what exactly is going on behind the scenes in the repository. What matters is how can we improve the experience for the client. And the first thing that we can do here, which is actually very cheap, is to add what is known as a problem details service. So what is that service? That service allows us to turn these failure responses into proper problem details. Now, what are these problem details? Well, if I show you this page very briefly, I'm going to show you this. So there is an entire specification, a well-known standard on how to report problems in HTTP APIs, right? This page describes everything that you want to know about how exactly you should be forming your responses so that they have all of the right information, right? I'm not going to read all of this. The good thing is that in ASP.NET Core, there's already a service that allows you to convert your error responses into problem details, right? And so let me show you how to enable that. What we're going to do is just change here, just under my add singleton call over here. I'm going to add problem details just like this. And by doing this, we are adding the service that is able to collect and prepare that additional metadata for the response, for the error response. But we have to do a little bit more than that because we have to also add a middleware so that problem details can be used as part of the pipeline, right? So just down here, just under app, we're going to do the following. We're going to say app.use status code pages, right? That's the first piece of middleware that you want to include so that those problem details can be turned into proper, like it says, status code pages that can show the information back to us by going into the middleware. But that's going to work only for kind of expected status codes, right? And what I mean is that that's going to help in the case of here, for instance, when we return results not found, right? That's going to help there. But it's not going to help really with exceptional cases, exceptions like we're interested in right now. For that, what you want to do is just say app.use exception handler, right? By using this middleware here, now your exceptions are actually going to be turned into problem details by taking advantage of the problem details service. All right, so let's take a look at that. Let's see how that actually works. So let's go ahead and run the application once again. And I'm going to go back into my hello exceptions HTTP file over here. And then let me close this. So now when we send the request, as you're going to see on the right side, I mean, we still have the 500 internal server error over here, right? Well, we have the 500 internal server error, but now down here, as you can see, we also have this entire section, as you can see, this entire section of a JSON section that describes our problem details by following the standard. As you can see, there's RFC 9110. This is a standard way to report problem details back to the client, right? And as you can see, it has a title that says an error occurred while processing the request, right? And status 500. So this is a better experience than what we have initially, right? When we had absolutely nothing in the body of the response. But still, it's not enough for us to diagnose what's going on, how to correlate this with the backend. And in fact, if we look at our logs over here, we're going to see in the logs in the backend that, we do have the exception stack trace over here, but there's not enough information for us to correlate this with what's going on with that response, right? There's not enough information. So how can we deal with this? What we're really missing here is some sort of exception handling, right? So proper exception handling. So let's see how can we achieve that. Let's close this and let's close that and over here. And let's go ahead back into our program.cs file over here. And of course, what we can start doing here is to add some sort of perhaps try catch, right? The typical try catch, we could go into each of our endpoints, start adding try catch statements here, and to start adding some logging and to start responding with proper probabilities back into the client with more metadata. But that's going to be a little bit time consuming, and that's going to mean that we're going to be repeating that same code over and over again into each of our endpoints, right? So we don't really want to do that. What we want to do is to implement what is known as a global exception handler, so that anytime an exception happens, we just catch it there and we do something about it in that central location. Okay, so how to go ahead and implement that exception handler? Let me show you how. What we're going to do is first open up our Solution Explorer down here. Okay, let me collapse the other one for a moment. And we're going to go ahead and just right click on the project. Let's add a brand new file. And we're going to name this one, which is going to be a class. Let's name it Global Exception Handler. Of course, you can name it with any name, it doesn't matter. But this is going to be the file that's going to implement the new iException handler interface that's available starting with .NET 8. Okay, so you're going to go ahead and implement iException handler. Okay, and then let's do control dot so we can go ahead and implement the interface right here. And so as you can see, all you have to do is implement this one method here, try handle async, which is going to be invoked anytime an exception is thrown from somewhere in the application where you're not handling that exception. Okay. Now let me put the parameters down here so we can see better. As you can see here, you're going to receive the HTTP context, you're going to receive the exception and even a cancellation token. Okay, so now we have to decide what to do over here anytime an exception comes in. So what should we do? Well, the first thing we should do is add some proper logging in the backend, right, with enough information for us to correlate later. So to do that, let's go ahead and introduce a logger here. So I'm going to declare private read-only. Going to be an iLogger of type global exception handler, right? And let's go ahead and also introduce this into our constructors. Let's actually generate a constructor, and we can probably improve this. Let me control dot here by using a primary constructor, right? So that's what it is. Okay. So now we have our logger. And now that we have the logger, we can go ahead and write some sort of logging that's relevant for our application. What we're going to do, even before actually using the logging, is to create some sort of identifier of the request, right? Some sort of trace identifier, trace ID, right? That's ID that we're going to be correlating from the backend all the way back into the client, right? So to define that trace ID, what you can do is the following. You can just say, okay, so var trace ID is going to be this line over here. Now, what this line is doing is saying, okay, so I'm going to go ahead and either try to get the ID from the current activity, right? So the activity is kind of the activity ID is the identifier of an operation that relates to the current thread in your application, right? So every thread, every operation in your .NET application is going to have some sort of activity, current activity, right? But in the case that there is no activity for some reason, we're going to say, okay, in that case, we're just going to go ahead and get the trace identifier of the HTTP context, which is the identifier that every single request is going to automatically get for you, right? So that's a way that we have to capture some sort of trace ID. And now that we have the trace ID, we can go ahead and actually create some sort of error. So we're going to say logger.log error. Yep. And so we're going to first start with that exception. Let me send it to the other line. So we're going to get the exception, and then we're going to provide some sort of a message, right? So what we're going to do is the following. We're going to say, could not process a request on machine. And here we're going to start providing some richer information to this exception that we're logging in the backend, right? We're going to say that the machine is going to be machine name, right? So I'm using structure logging here. I'm going to provide a value for that in a moment. And then I'm going to also say that I'm going to mention here what's going to be that trace ID, so that it gets captured in the structure log. So the trace ID is going to be just that value of the of trace ID that I'm going to provide in a moment. Now, Let's provide parameters for this. For the machine name, we're going to be using environment.machineName. And for the trace ID, of course, we're going to be using the trace ID variable that we just captured, right? So that's going to give us some good logs. And let me close this and that. Okay, that's going to provide us some good logs in the backend. But now we have to provide some proper response. I mean, in the response test has to be all of this important information. And also we have to figure out how to map that exception into the proper status code and a good title, right? And so for that, what you can do is the following. You can just say await, right? And you're going to use the results class here, results. And then we're going to say problem, right? Results problem. And then here you can provide a series of parameters to define what you want to include to that problem details, standard problem details that are going to return back to the client. So let's start with the title. We're going to set some title here, and we're going to figure out how to do the proper title in a second. So let's just leave it empty for now. We're going to go back to that in a moment. We're going to provide some status code. So let's go for standard 500 error for a moment. We're going to go back to this in a moment also. But also, what you can specify here is what is known as extensions, right? So extensions are a way to provide some additional details into your problem details. So let's do extensions. And this extensions is going to be a dictionary, right, of type string, a string object, but this has a few particularities. So this is going to be a nullable object here, right? And to actually define the trace ID, we're going to say is just with this syntax over here. So trace ID, and then we're going to do comma, and this is the trace ID. All right, so just close that, and that should define our problem details. Now, in order to actually send this problem details object into the client, what we're going to do is just to do dot here and then do execute async, and then we send in the HTTP context. So that's going to write directly these problem details into the current HTTP context, right, and then out into the response that's going to go back into the client, right? So that's that, and then. Also, this method here, as you can see from the signature, it needs to return a Boolean, right? It needs to return a Boolean, true or false, right? So what does that mean? Well, if we return true here, as we're going to do, return true, that means that the pipeline has to stop here, right? There's nothing else that needs to execute after this exception handler, and it means that we have properly handled the exception. If you want to, you can just return false, and that means that the pipeline, it will keep executing any other middleware that happens to be waiting after this middleware here, right? And so you could use that if you wanted. You can implement multiple exception handlers for multiple exceptions, and so you can have some of them just return false and some of them return true for the final one if you wanted to. But for this exercise, let's just return true. We're going to say that here is where everything stops because we're handling the exception properly, all right? And so now, one thing that we're missing here, of course, is a proper title and the proper status code depending on the exception that we're handling here. And so to deal with that, what we're going to do is to implement a little mapping function that can deal with this mapping situation, right? And so what we're going to do is just down here, we're going to implement private static, and this is going to actually return a tuple so that we can return both the status code and the title in just one response, right? So this is going to return status code, and it's going to return a title. All right, a title. And then let's name this one map exception, and it's going to receive our exception. All right. Okay, so that's the signature. And then what we're going to do here is to, of course, use a switch, just like it is being suggested right now. I'm going to actually take that suggestion. So by default, we're going to be returning a 500 internal server error, but we also want to be able to deal with specific exceptions to map them to proper things. Now, for this, let's actually take a quick look at what's going on with that repository. So why is it drawing exceptions, right? And so as you can see, in the getAllAsync method, what we have done is just simulate that it is returning an invalid operation exception whenever the supposedly database connection is closed, right? And in the case of getAsync, when the ID is less than 1, there's a little rule here that says that you cannot have an ID less than 1, so we're going to be returning an argument out of an exception. So what we're going to do here is that for our application, we're going to say that whenever we have an argument out of an exception, we want to turn that into a BAT request back into the client, right? And we want to send the actual message that's here, this message here, we want to include it as part of the problem details. But for any other exception, including this invalid operation exception, we are just fine with the 500 error, all right? And so because of that, let's go back into global exception handler. What we can do is the following. We can say that our argument out of range exception is going to map into the following tuple is going to be a status 400 bad request. And for the message, instead of just saying bad request, we're going to say exception.message, right? That's going to be the response. And then in the other case, instead of just saying internal server error, because that's not very friendly, we're going to actually do a message like, we made a mistake, but we are working on it. All right, that's going to be our message. Okay, and so with this mapping function, we can, of course, you could expand this for many more exceptions if you wanted to, but for now, we're going to go ahead and just use that function down here. Okay, let's use that function over here so that we can capture, right? We're going to capture the status code and title into that map exception function over there, right? So we invoke map exception with exception and we get back status code and title. And now that we have those two, we can go ahead and use the title over here and the status code down here, right? Status code, all right? And yeah, I mean, at this point, we have our global exception handler ready, right? It has everything that we need at this point to properly catch every single exception that's not handled anywhere else in the application and map it to the proper problem details response. Now, we do need to register this global exception handler back in program.cs. So let me show you how to do that. So we're back in program.cs. And what you want to do here is just this. Just after our call to add program details, we can just chain one more call. Let's do that. Where we're going to say add exception handler, and that's going to be our global exception handler. Okay, and just by doing that, we are plugging everything up, and so we should be able to now see a much better response. So let's go back into our terminal. Let's go ahead and let me actually clean this for a moment. .NET Run. Okay, and then let's go back into our file over here, HTTP exceptions, this one over here. Okay, let's close this. And now let's see what happens when we try to invoke the game's endpoint here. So send request. And as you can see on the right side, of course, we still get our 500 internal server error over there. But if we see down here, the response down here has been improved, right? So now we do have our title that says we made a mistake, but we're working on it. Okay, that's expected. It is a 500 error. And we have a trace ID down here that we can use to correlate back to the logs, right? So in fact, if we open the logs right now, so let's open the logs and let's look at what's going on here. So here's the exception. And if we scroll down a little bit here, we should be able to match the trace ID that's right here with the trace ID that we have down there, right? So they are exactly the same trace ID. So this is incredibly useful because now if a client reports the trace ID, you can now go into your logs, right? Wherever you're storing your logs in the cloud and just find the trace ID and immediately start figuring out, okay, so the database connection is closed and okay, let's do something about that, right? So you know exactly what's going on, okay? So that's the power of this. And not only that, we are properly mapping the exceptions, right? So now if you go into this other request over here, right, with the case where we're providing a 0, where 0 is an invalid ID via our rules in the repository. So if you now try to send this request, it's going to also return an exception, but in this case, as you can see, it's going to return a 400 bar request. So it's no longer a 500 as it was before. So it's a 400, it's a proper response, and we have our proper details over here with a proper title that says the ID must be greater than 0, which is the exception, the message that we got in the repository itself. And then we also have our trace ID and the status code, right? So that is a much better way to map all of these exceptions into responses that we can actually use to diagnose what's going on with the application, right? And so that's almost it. But there's one more thing that I want to show you. It's a small trick because if you see the logs down here, we actually have more than one log for every failure, right? So notice here that we have one failure here, right? That says that's coming from the exception handler middleware, right? And then we have another log here that's coming from our global exception handler, right? So we're getting 2 logs for every exception. I don't really like to have 2 logs. It's just that the default exception handler is already logging for you, but you don't want to do that necessarily. So what I'm going to do is just stop this, and this. And let me close the other. So let me just go, actually let's close all. Let's go into app.settings.json. And what we can do is to add a login section here to mute the default login that the standard exception handler is doing there, right? So what we can do is just add the following. And I'm going to copy this to just not mess things up. I'm going to just copy this from my notepad right there. And by adding this line here, what I'm saying is that for anything that the exception handler middleware is reporting by itself, I don't want to be logging anything. I want to do all the logs directly in my global exception handler, right? So that's what you're saying over there. So if I go ahead and do .NET Run, again, and actually let me before we do that, let's just clean this and let's do .NET Run. Let's go back into our file and let's go ahead and run this again. And again, we get the same thing on the response, but now in the login side, as you can see, we only have one exception reported in the logs. There is no more duplication of those logs over here. All right. So yeah, so hopefully that's useful. That's what I wanted to show you today. That's the right way to handle exceptions properly so that you can have a much better time diagnosing the issues in your application. So yeah, I hope you liked it, and I'll see you in the next video.